Her reflection stared back from the polished elevator doors of the Harrington Tower boardroom suite. Lips split, one knee on the floor, her husband's hand still raised. His mistress stood behind him, arms folded, wearing Elaine's grandmother's brooch. Every director on the 44th floor witnessed it in silence. None of them knew the brooch held a memory stick. Neither did he. The gold brooch caught the light before Elaine caught anything else. That was the first thing her eyes found when she turned toward the elevator doors. Not her own face, not her husband's raised hand, not the 11 board members sitting frozen at the long white table behind her. She found that brooch, small, oval, the color of old honey in November light. It had a hairline scratch along the lower left edge from the time her grandmother, Miss Odette, dropped it on the kitchen floor in 1994 and laughed about it for 20 minutes. Elaine had watched her laugh. She had been 7 years old, and she could still hear it. That full, unguarded sound that had no self-consciousness in it whatsoever. The woman wearing it now was named Simone Voss. She stood 3 feet behind Lawrence Carter, her arms folded across her chest, wearing an expression that lived somewhere between satisfaction and ceremony. She had positioned herself like a person who had already been told how this night would end. Lawrence had said 4 words. He had said them in the particular register he used for things he considered minor corrections. The same voice he used with valets and security guards. The voice that required no response and expected none. He said, "You are embarrassing yourself." Then his hand came forward. The sound of it disappeared almost immediately into the dense acoustics of the room. White linen tablecloths. Crystal. 44th floor insulation. A room built for announcements and deal signings and the controlled performance of confidence. The sound was gone before anyone at the table had processed what they had just seen. Elaine went to one knee. Not from the force of it, though the force was real, and her lip caught the edge of her own teeth, and she tasted something copper and small. She went to one knee because she had already decided, somewhere in the long architecture of that evening, that this was not the moment. This was not the room. This was not yet. She pressed her fingertips to the carpet. She looked up at her own reflection in the elevator doors across the room. Her face was very still. Her eyes were completely clear. None of the 11 board members spoke. The 2 senior partners near the window had stopped mid-sentence. A caterer near the service entrance had gone perfectly rigid with a dessert tray in both hands, not knowing whether to leave or stay, choosing to stay because leaving felt like an abandonment of something. Lawrence straightened his jacket. He turned back toward the table as though the moment had already concluded and filed itself correctly. Elaine stayed on one knee for exactly 3 seconds longer than necessary. Then she stood. She did not reach for her face. She did not look at Simone. She looked at the brooch one more time, long enough to confirm the hairline scratch. And then she walked back to her seat at the far end of the table, sat down, and placed both hands flat on the white linen in front of her. She had made one phone call that morning. It was already done. Everything else was timing. 15 years before that night, Elaine Mouton was 26 years old, and she had the kind of quiet competence that rooms didn't know how to hold. She sat in a mid-size financial firm in Atlanta with spreadsheets open on 2 monitors and a cup of coffee that had gone cold on her left because she kept forgetting to drink it. She was not forgetting because she was distracted. She was forgetting because she was focused, the kind of focus that turns a Tuesday into a tunnel, and the only thing at the end of the tunnel is the work. Lawrence Carter walked through that office like a man who had already decided he belonged in a larger one. He was handsome in a specific way, the way of a man who knew how to be in a room and had practiced it. He wore good suits that were one season ahead of everyone else's good suits. He laughed at the right moments. He asked questions that sounded like compliments. He asked to see Elaine's projections for the Meridian client presentation. She pulled them up without hesitation. She trusted competence in others the way she trusted her own, naturally, until given specific reason not to. She walked him through the model. He nodded. He asked one follow-up question that she answered in 40 seconds. He thanked her and left. The next morning, she arrived at the conference room for the Meridian presentation and found her numbers on Lawrence's slides with his name at the bottom. She sat in the back. She watched the room respond to her work. She watched Lawrence collect the applause with the ease of a man receiving something he had always believed was his. She found him afterward in the hallway near the copy room. She told him what he had done in a single sentence. She used no extra words. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she would spend the next decade trying to correctly identify, something between surprise and amusement, as though he had expected her to be smaller than she was. Then he smiled and said, "You're right. I'll fix it." He did not fix it. But the next morning, there were yellow tulips on her desk. Her grandmother's favorite flower. She had mentioned it once, in passing, 3 weeks earlier. He had remembered. That was the part she held on to. That was the part that softened the edge of what she already knew. They were married 3 years later, in a small ceremony in Decatur. The church smelled like gardenias and old wood polish, and the specific warmth of a room full of people who have known each other long enough to stop performing. Elaine's mother, Patricia, had pressed her own hands together in the front pew and stared at the floor with the expression of a woman who is deciding whether to say something and deciding against it. Elaine had noticed. She had filed it. She had chosen, in the way she chose many things in those years, to love the moment she was standing in rather than the meaning of what she had noticed. Her grandmother, Miss Odette, stood beside her in the vestibule and pressed something into Elaine's hand just before she walked. A gold brooch, small, oval, the color of old honey. Miss Odette had worn it to every important moment of her adult life. Her own wedding, her husband's funeral, the day she signed the deed on the Gwinnett County property, the day she stood in front of a county board and refused to sell it to a developer who had come with a briefcase and a low number and the assumption that her patience had a price. She pressed it firmly into her granddaughter's palm and said, "Keep this close. A woman always needs something of her own." Elaine looked at her grandmother's face for a moment, the fine lines around her eyes, the particular steadiness in them that had been earned over 80 years and could not be borrowed or faked. And then she nodded. She pinned it inside the bodice of her wedding dress, against her chest, where no one could see it. The way her grandmother had meant it, not as decoration, but as reminder. After the honeymoon, it went into her jewelry box and stayed there for 14 years. But Elaine never forgot it was there. She thought of it the way you think of something foundational, not daily, but always. The way you know a house has a cornerstone without needing to see it every morning. It was enough to know it was there. It was enough to know it had been placed there by someone who understood that the world has a habit of asking women to give away the things they should keep. The marriage did not break all at once. That was the particular cruelty of it. The way it held its shape long after the shape had lost its meaning. Lawrence built Carter Acquisitions in the first 4 years of their marriage on the back of a deal Elaine had structured from scratch. She had spent 11 months on that first acquisition model, the framework that convinced their initial investors, the language that made institutional lenders take a young black entrepreneur seriously when every door was closing. That model had her fingerprints on every line. Lawrence's name was on the cover. She had accepted that arrangement because she believed in the marriage the way she had believed in the work, completely, until given specific reason not to. She became the director of strategic development. She built systems. She hired people. She trained them well and treated them with the kind of directness that made people stay at a company for decades. She brought Carter Acquisitions from 12 employees to 140 in 7 years. She did not do this loudly. She did it the way she did everything, carefully, thoroughly, with her hands on every detail and her name on very few of the announcements. Lawrence gave speeches at galas and industry conferences, and the speeches were good. They were good partly because Elaine helped him write them, sitting at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings with a red pen and a glass of water, sharpening the language without once asking to be credited for the sharpness. Lawrence discovered Simone Voss at an industry conference in Charlotte 2 years ago. Elaine did not discover this through any dramatic revelation. She discovered it the way you discover most quiet things, through accumulation. A phone left face down in a room it had never been left face down in before. A word said in a particular tone that had not been in his vocabulary before. A change in the way he stood when he talked about the office. A new self-consciousness in his posture that had not been there the previous year. She filed each observation carefully and said nothing. Simone joined Carter Acquisitions as Director of Strategy 6 months later. She was brilliant in a particular way, the way of someone who is very good at reading a room and packaging what the room wants to hear back to itself. Lawrence began crediting her in meetings. He began sitting her at his right hand at dinners. He began ordering Elaine's meals without asking. At first she thought it was habit. Then she understood it was erasure. The kind so gradual you almost convince yourself it is something else. At a company anniversary dinner, he introduced Simone to a sitting senator as the woman behind Carter Acquisitions. Elaine was seated at the far end of that table. She reached for her water glass, took one sip, and set it back down exactly where it had been. Simone had been busy in other ways. She moved through the board members like weather, specific, unhurried, arriving in each conversation with exactly the piece of information most useful to the direction she wanted. She told 3 board members privately that Elaine had been mismanaging the Harrington subsidiary fund. She told them Elaine was preparing to exit the company with assets. She said this with the particular sadness of someone reluctantly sharing a truth they wish weren't true. She had timed it to land the week after Miss Odette's funeral, when Elaine took 2 weeks away from the office. The office that Elaine had built received the rumor in her absence, the way dry ground receives water. Lawrence's mother, Constance, had been Simone's second source of fuel. Constance Carter was a woman who had wanted her son to marry status and received instead someone who worked, who built quietly and refused to perform gratitude for being included at tables she had helped construct. Constance had never forgiven Elaine for that self-possession. There was a dinner, 2 years into the marriage, where Elaine had corrected a misattribution Lawrence made about the Meridian deal in front of 4 guests, gently, accurately, with no malice. And Constance had watched from across the table with an expression that Elaine had seen only once before, on the face of a woman at a community board meeting who had just realized she was not the most prepared person in the room and had decided in that moment to make the more prepared person pay for it. Constance began passing information. Elaine's schedule, her private conversations, the things she said in the rare moments she allowed herself to speak freely with Lawrence. The private language of a marriage that she had not yet understood was being recorded in the service of her own undoing. Constance told herself she was protecting her son. She was protecting her preferred version of her son, which was a different thing entirely, and she never once examined the difference. Lawrence's brother Darnell called Elaine the week after Miss Odette's funeral and said, "I'm on your side, whatever you need." She thanked him. She believed him for approximately 72 hours, which was how long it took her to learn that he had already agreed to vote with Lawrence on the board restructuring that would remove Elaine's remaining shares. She did not call Darnell back. She did not confront him. She sat in her car in the Harrington Tower parking garage on a Tuesday evening with her badge rejected at the executive elevator, downgraded, quietly, while she was grieving, and she opened her laptop instead. The cursor blinked in the document she had been building for 4 months. She added 3 new entries. Then she drove home. 3 weeks before the shareholder dinner, Elaine was inside her grandmother's house in Gwinnett County. Miss Odette had left it to her directly, bypassing Elaine's mother in the will with a specific legal note that Elaine later understood had been deliberate and protective. The house smelled like cedar and the particular sweetness of old wood in autumn. Elaine was moving through it slowly, cataloging, not rushing, because the house deserved that much. The cedar box was under the bed in the back room. Elaine found it the way you find things you were not looking for, but were somehow always going to find. Her hand moved toward it before her attention did. She pulled it out. It was not heavy. Inside, under a layer of tissue paper that had gone soft with age, was an envelope. Inside the envelope was a single document, a land deed, 40 acres in Gwinnett County, Georgia. Registered in 1987 in the name of Odette Mouton and her daughter, Patricia Mouton, Elaine's mother, Elaine's land. She turned the document over. She read every line. She read it again. The property address placed it precisely inside a southeastern development corridor that Carter Acquisitions had been expanding into for the past 3 years. She knew that corridor. She had reviewed the asset filings herself before her access had been downgraded. That land was listed. It was in the portfolio. It had a valuation. It had been used. Elaine folded the document back into the envelope with both hands, very slowly. The way you fold something you intend to keep forever. She pressed the flap down. She put it in the inside pocket of her coat. She stood up from the edge of the bed. She went to the kitchen, and she cooked dinner, something her grandmother used to make, rice and butter beans, and she ate it at the kitchen table without turning on the television. She drove home in the dark. She set Lawrence's place at the dinner table. He did not come home until after she was asleep. She had not expected him to. She had not needed him to. She had made a decision in that kitchen that she did not articulate even to herself. She did not need to. It was the kind of decision that does not announce itself. It simply settles. Gerald Okafor had been Miss Odette's personal attorney for 30 years. He was 71 years old, senior partner at Okafor and Webb, the firm his father had founded in 1962 on Auburn Avenue in a 2-room office above a barbershop, the kind of founding that required both courage and the specific stubbornness of a man who knew what he was worth and refused to let the world's disagreement on that matter become his permanent address. Gerald had grown the firm to 22 attorneys. He had argued before the Georgia Supreme Court 11 times. He had the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades being the most prepared person in every room he entered, and had grown so accustomed to that condition that it no longer required any effort. He called Elaine the morning after she found the cedar box. She answered on the second ring. He told her that Miss Odette had left him a sealed letter with one instruction: when Elaine finds the box, call her. He told her Miss Odette had been watching Lawrence Carter for 6 years. He told her he had a file, and that the file had been growing. What she had found in the cedar box was the key to a door that was already built. They had just been waiting for her to arrive at it. I want you to understand what that moment meant. Not the legal part. The part where a dead woman had loved her granddaughter so precisely and so quietly that she had spent 6 years building a protection around her that she would only receive after she was gone. Miss Odette had understood something about Lawrence Carter that she had never said aloud to anyone. Not to Elaine, not to Patricia, not even to Gerald, except in the careful, documented language of legal instruction. She had understood that the man her granddaughter had married was the kind of man who builds slowly and takes slowly, and never makes a move that can be immediately recognized as the wrong one. She had watched him do it, and she had spent 6 years making sure that when the time came, Elaine would not be standing in an empty room. Elaine sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment after Gerald finished speaking. Then she said, "Tell me everything." Gerald told her. The first thing Gerald laid out was the forged waiver. 18 months ago, Lawrence had removed Elaine from 2 Carter Acquisitions accounts using a spousal asset waiver with her signature on it. The signature was not hers. Gerald had the bank records. He had subpoenaed them using the land deed as his legal standing. The land gave Elaine a stake in Carter Acquisition's assets that predated the marriage, which gave Gerald the right to pull documents Lawrence had believed were buried. Lawrence had been confident those records were inaccessible. He had been confident because the people he had trusted with that confidence had told him so. He had never considered that a 30-year attorney with a sealed letter from a grandmother and a land deed from 1987 might represent a category of problem his network had not anticipated. The second thing was older and larger. She pulled it out. It was not heavy. Inside, under a layer of tissue paper that had gone soft with age, was an envelope. Inside the envelope was a single document, a land deed. 40 acres in Gwinnett County, Georgia. Registered in 1987 in the name of Odette Mouton and her daughter, Patricia Mouton. Elaine's mother, Elaine's land. She turned the document over. She read every line. She read it again. The property address placed it precisely inside a southeastern development corridor that Carter Acquisitions had been expanding into for the past 3 years. She knew that corridor. She had reviewed the asset filings herself before her access had been downgraded. That land was listed. It was in the portfolio. It had a valuation. It had been used. Elaine folded the document back into the envelope with both hands, very slowly, the way you fold something you intend to keep forever. She pressed the flap down. She put it in the inside pocket of her coat. She stood up from the edge of the bed. She went to the kitchen and she cooked dinner, something her grandmother used to make, rice and butter beans, and she ate it at the kitchen table without turning on the television. She drove home in the dark. She set Lawrence's place at the dinner table. He did not come home until after she was asleep. She had not expected him to. She had not needed him to. She had made a decision in that kitchen that she did not articulate even to herself. She did not need to. It was the kind of decision that does not announce itself. It simply settles. Gerald Okafor had been Miss Odette's personal attorney for 30 years. He was 71 years old, senior partner at Okafor and Webb, the firm his father had founded in 1962 on Auburn Avenue in a 2-room office above a barbershop, the kind of founding that required both courage and the specific stubbornness of a man who knew what he was worth and refused to let the world's disagreement on that matter become his permanent address. Gerald had grown the firm to 22 attorneys. He had argued before the Georgia Supreme Court 11 times. He had the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades being the most prepared person in every room he entered, and had grown so accustomed to that condition that it no longer required any effort. He called Elaine the morning after she found the cedar box. She answered on the second ring. He told her that Miss Odette had left him a sealed letter with one instruction. When Elaine finds the box, call her. He told her Miss Odette had been watching Lawrence Carter for 6 years. He told her he had a file and that the file had been growing. What she had found in the cedar box was the key to a door that was already built. They had just been waiting for her to arrive at it. I want you to understand what that moment meant. Not the legal part. The part where a dead woman had loved her granddaughter so precisely and so quietly that she had spent 6 years building a protection around her that she would only receive after she was gone. Miss Odette had understood something about Lawrence Carter that she had never said aloud to anyone, not to Elaine, not to Patricia, not even to Gerald, except in the careful, documented language of legal instruction. She had understood that the man her granddaughter had married was the kind of man who builds slowly and takes slowly and never makes a move that can be immediately recognized as the wrong one. She had watched him do it, and she had spent 6 years making sure that when the time came, Elaine would not be standing in an empty room. Elaine sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment after Gerald finished speaking. Then she said, "Tell me everything." Gerald told her. The first thing Gerald laid out was the forged waiver. 18 months ago, Lawrence had removed Elaine from two Carter Acquisitions accounts using a spousal asset waiver with her signature on it. The signature was not hers. Gerald had the bank records. He had subpoenaed them using the land deed as his legal standing. The land gave Elaine a stake in Carter Acquisitions assets that predated the marriage, which gave Gerald the right to pull documents Lawrence had believed were buried. Lawrence had been confident those records were inaccessible. He had been confident because the people he had trusted with that confidence had told him so. He had never considered that a 30-year attorney with a sealed letter from a grandmother and a land deed from 1987 might represent a category of problem his network had not anticipated. The second thing was older and larger. Gerald had been in contact with a former Carter Acquisitions employee, a financial analyst named Brennan Webb, no relation to the firm, who had been wrongfully terminated 3 years ago after he had quietly flagged irregularities in the company's founding asset structure. Brennan had kept copies of everything. He had kept them in a fireproof box in his garage in Stone Mountain, and he had kept them with the particular patience of a man who knows that the truth has a shelf life only if you let it, and he had decided not to let it. The projections that launched Carter Acquisitions' first major acquisition, the Meridian deal, were traceable line by line to documents generated on a company computer assigned to Elaine Mouton in the 2 years before her marriage. Lawrence had not only taken her work in a conference room hallway in Atlanta, he had built an empire on it and spent 15 years making sure her name was nowhere on the building. The third thing was Simone. Gerald placed a notarized document on his desk, the spousal asset waiver, and pointed to the notary seal in the lower right corner. The seal belonged to a notary registered to a business in Fulton County. The business had been Simone Voss's, dissolved 14 months ago, 3 months after the waiver was signed. Simone had notarized a document she knew was fraudulent. She had been in the room. She had pressed the seal into the paper with her own hand. And then she had walked out of that room and attended a company dinner that evening, and raised a glass at the right moment, and smiled at the right people, and had never once, as far as anyone could tell, lost a minute of sleep over it. The fourth thing was federal. Gerald said the word carefully, not dramatically, just precisely, the way you say a word that carries its own weight and does not need decoration. The Gwinnett County land had been used as collateral in a federal development grant application submitted by Carter Acquisitions 2 years ago. The application had been approved. The grant had been received. The money had been spent on a corridor development project that now had Lawrence Carter's name on a bronze plaque outside the entrance. The land was not his to use. It had never been his. Using stolen property as collateral for a federal grant was wire fraud. Gerald had filed a preliminary disclosure with the U.S. Attorney's Office 11 days before he called Elaine. He had already spoken, privately, to 3 members of Carter Acquisitions' board of directors. 3 men who had not known the full picture, and who, once they saw it, understood exactly what they had been unknowingly participating in, and wanted no part of what came next. They had agreed to cooperate. They had signed documents. Gerald told Elaine their names. She recognized all 3. She had hired 2 of them herself in the first year of the company's expansion, when Lawrence had been focused on the next deal, and she had been focused on building the team that would make the next deal possible. Elaine listened to all of it without interrupting. When Gerald finished, she asked one question. "How much time do we have?" Gerald told her the shareholder dinner was in 3 weeks. She nodded as though he could see her. Then she said, "I know where the brooch is." Gerald paused. It was a short pause, the kind a very careful man takes when a conversation has just introduced a variable he had not anticipated. Then he said, "Tell me about the brooch." Elaine told him. When she finished, Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman." Elaine said, "I know." There was nothing else to add to that. Some things are simply true, and the only appropriate response is acknowledgement. The night of the shareholder dinner arrived the way significant nights do, ordinary on the outside, carrying everything underneath. The Harrington Tower dressed itself in white linen and low candlelight, the way it always did for these events. The caterers arrived at 4, the florist at 5. The board members began filtering in at 7, moving through the room with the practiced ease of people who attend these gatherings often enough that they have stopped noticing them. Lawrence arrived at 7:15 with Simone beside him. He was in a dark suit, with a white pocket square folded with the precision of a man who checks these things in the elevator. He moved through the room the way he always moved, greeting people with the specific warmth of a man who has perfected the appearance of warmth. And he was, that night, at the summit of his confidence. He had already had a conversation with his lawyer that morning. The divorce filing was prepared. The board restructuring was scheduled for the following week. After tonight, the announcement of Simone's co-CEO promotion would signal to everyone in that room that the transition was complete and final and correct. In the elevator on the way up, Lawrence adjusted Simone's collar. He straightened the gold brooch at the base of her neck and said, "After tonight, everything is exactly where it belongs." Simone smiled. She had been rehearsing her remarks in the car on the way there, running the words quietly behind her lips the way an actor runs lines before the curtain. She believed she was untouchable. She had constructed that belief from the materials Lawrence had given her, and she had never once wondered whether the materials were load-bearing. Elaine arrived at 7:40. She had taken care with her appearance in the way of someone who understands that appearance is also a form of language. She wore a deep navy dress, no jewelry, no performance. She checked her coat at the door with the calm of a woman arriving somewhere she had been before and knew precisely how to navigate. She carried nothing visible. She walked to her seat at the far end of the table, the seat she had been assigned 2 years ago when the signal had first been sent, and she sat down. She placed both hands flat on the white linen. She was calm in a way that did not read as calm. It read as conclusion. The way a door looks when it is about to close. Gerald Okafor was already in the building. He was 1 floor below in a secondary conference room with 2 attorneys from his firm, a federal courier, and a projector that had been set up 2 hours earlier. He had a sealed folder for each of the 11 board members. He had a presentation loaded and ready. He had been ready since Tuesday. He was drinking coffee from a paper cup and reading a brief when his phone vibrated with a text from Elaine. The text said one word. It said, "Ready." Gerald set down his coffee. He straightened his tie. He looked at the 2 attorneys across the table and said, "Let's give her a few minutes." The attorneys nodded. Nobody in that room was hurrying. There was no need to hurry. Everything was already where it needed to be. Lawrence stood to make his announcement at 8:47. He tapped his glass once, a clean, familiar sound, and the room went attentive in the way of rooms that have been trained to respond to that particular signal. He thanked the board. He thanked the investors. He spoke about vision and momentum and the evolution of Carter Acquisitions towards something larger and more significant than what it had previously been. He used the word legacy twice. He gestured toward Simone and said that the next chapter of Carter Acquisitions had a new face, a new energy, and a new direction. He said this with the complete confidence of a man who has never genuinely considered that a room might contain information he does not have. She stood. She stood slowly, without urgency, from her seat at the far end of the table. The room registered her movement the way rooms register something unexpected. A brief recalibration, heads turning, a shift in attention. She addressed the room in a single sentence. She said, "Before we celebrate, there is a document this board has a legal obligation to see." The side door opened. Gerald Okafor walked through it with the measured pace of a man who has been unhurried for 71 years and sees no reason to change that now. Behind him, his 2 attorneys moved along the length of the table, placing a sealed folder in front of each board member with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this kind of thing before, and will do it again. 11 folders. 11 sets of hands reaching for them, some quickly, some slowly, all inevitably. The projector screen descended behind the head table. It came down without drama, just a mechanical hum, and then the soft white rectangle of it, filling the wall. Then the image appeared. A document. 1987 typeface. Gwinnett County Recorder's Office seal in the upper right corner. 2 names in the property holder field. Odette Mouton. Patricia Mouton. Below it, framed in the projector's clean light, the Carter Acquisitions federal grant application. The property listed in the collateral section. The same address. The same land. 2 documents. 1 fact. The room was completely silent. Not the silence of people waiting to speak. The silence of people who have stopped processing and are simply receiving. Lawrence's face moved through several expressions in the space of 4 seconds. The first was confusion, genuine, unperformed, the confusion of a man encountering information that should not exist. The second was calculation, his eyes moving across the room with the rapid inventory of a person looking for the exit in a burning building. The third was the moment he looked at the 3 board members who had agreed to cooperate. Men he had known for years, men he had trusted, men who were sitting with their folders open and their eyes down, and understood what their stillness meant. Not neutrality. Conclusion. Simone was standing 2 feet from him. Her hand had gone to her collar without her deciding to put it there. She was touching the gold brooch the way you touch something you suddenly need to understand. She looked at Lawrence. He looked at the brooch. He looked at Elaine. And somewhere in the wiring of his mind, the connection completed. The brooch that had been in Elaine's jewelry box. The brooch she had never once worn in 14 years of marriage. The brooch now sitting at Simone's collar on this specific night. And he understood what it had carried into the room with her. The memory stick had been a backup. Every document in those 11 folders, every bank record and forged signature and notary seal and federal filing, existed in duplicate on a drive no larger than a thumbnail, housed inside a gold brooch with a hairline scratch along the lower left edge. Elaine had placed it on Simone's collar herself, not literally, but through the chain of events she had set in motion and managed with the precision of someone who had been paying attention for 15 years. She had known that Lawrence would find the brooch in her jewelry box. She had known what he would do with it. She had let him do it. Simone took 1 step back, then another. The step back was not a decision. It was a body responding to a conclusion the mind had not yet fully reached. Elaine was not watching either of them. She was looking at the projection on the wall, at her grandmother's name in 1987 typeface, at the name that had been in that house in Gwinnett County for 37 years, waiting patiently to be spoken in a room large enough to matter. She kept her hands flat on the white linen. The room began to move around her. Voices starting, chairs shifting, the controlled chaos of people who have just witnessed something they will be describing for years. She stayed still at the center of it, the way certain things stay still. What he said next did not change anything. There was nothing left for him to say that could change anything. He said her name. He said it the way people say a name when they are finally out of other options. She did not look at him. The board voted to remove Lawrence Carter from the CEO position before the dinner was officially adjourned. The 3 cooperating board members provided the majority. The vote was recorded. The room cleared in stages, the way rooms clear after something significant, some people leaving quickly, some slowly, some standing for a long time near the windows not quite ready to exit. Lawrence's attorney was on the phone before the elevator doors opened. It did not matter. The federal disclosure had been filed 11 days ago. The documents were already moving through a process that his attorney had no authority over. Lawrence's company photograph, the one that had hung in the lobby of Harrington Tower for 6 years, was replaced within the week. Not dramatically. The replacement happened during a Tuesday night, between business hours, the way removals happen when institutions want to communicate something without having to say it aloud. His name was on the building. It came down 14 months later, during the course of the federal proceedings, at the request of the remaining board. Constance Carter stopped going to her church. She had attended Greater Refuge Baptist for 40 years. She had chaired the Women's Auxiliary for 17 of them, arranged flowers, organized repasts, helped with funerals, been present at every significant moment of that congregation's life. The elder board, informed quietly by a deacon who had been present at the shareholder dinner, asked her privately to step back from her committee roles while the matter involving her son's company was being publicly examined. They did not remove her from membership. They simply asked her to step back. That distinction, membership retained, standing withdrawn, was the one that cost her most. Not the legal proceedings, not the newspaper coverage. The Sunday mornings when she sat in the back pew instead of the front, and the women who had been her auxiliaries for decades looked at their programs instead of her face. Simone Voss left Atlanta in the 3rd week after the dinner. She did not announce her departure. Her apartment lease was quietly terminated. Her social media accounts went private and then disappeared. Lawrence called her twice in the 1st week. She did not answer either call. The relationship between a powerful man and the person who helps him consolidate that power has a very specific half-life. It ends at exactly the moment the power does. Simone had understood this dynamic clearly when she entered it. She had simply believed she would be on the correct side of it when the time came. She was not. She closed the window and walked away from it with the efficiency of someone who had already prepared for this contingency, even while telling herself it would never arrive. Darnell Carter called Elaine 3 times in the weeks that followed. She did not answer. She did not block his number either. She let the calls come and let them finish, and let the voicemails sit unlistened to in her phone. Not from cruelty. She had very little cruelty in her. From the simple understanding that some reconciliations require a maturity from the person seeking them that had not yet been demonstrated and could not be manufactured by a telephone call. It was Camille who found her in the parking garage after the dinner. Camille Webb, 31 years old, junior board observer, newly appointed, there for the first time that night on a credential she had worked 3 years to earn. She had watched the whole thing from her seat near the window. She had not spoken during the evening. She had simply watched Elaine with the attention of someone trying to understand something they have never seen before and know they need to learn. She found Elaine standing beside her car in the parking structure, keys already in hand, and said, "I want to know how you stayed that still." Elaine looked at her for a moment. In the parking garage light, Camille looked young and serious in equal measure. The combination that means a person is going to become someone eventually and is already working on it. Elaine said, "I had somewhere to be." Camille stood with that for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way you nod when you understand something you haven't quite absorbed yet but will. Elaine got in her car. She sat for a moment in the silence of it before she started the engine. Outside, through the concrete pillars of the garage, she could see a strip of Atlanta sky. The particular dark blue of a city night that is never fully dark because there are too many people still awake in it. She started the engine. She drove home. She did not turn on the radio. 6 months later, the back porch of Miss Odette's house in Gwinnett County held the particular silence of an early morning that has not yet decided what kind of day it will become. The kind of quiet that only exists before the rest of the world wakes up, before traffic, before phones, before the accumulated sound of people managing their lives. The trees at the edge of the property stood in the gray-pink light, with the patience of things that have been standing in that exact place for longer than any of the people who have ever looked at them. Elaine stood on the porch in a light jacket, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that she was actually drinking this time, not forgetting. The legal process had moved through its stages. The Gwinnett County land had been returned to her name 6 weeks ago. A clean restoration, documented and recorded. Her grandmother's name and her mother's name, and now her own name on a deed that belonged to them and had always belonged to them. She had not sold it. She would not sell it. She had begun talking to an architect about what it might become. She was holding the gold brooch. The memory stick had been removed, entered into federal evidence at Gerald's office in a small evidence envelope with a chain of custody label, and the brooch had been returned to her last week. Just the brooch now. The way it had always been before any of this. Small, oval, the color of old honey, with a hairline scratch along the lower left edge from the time her grandmother dropped it on the kitchen floor and laughed for 20 minutes. Elaine turned it over in her hand. Then again, she heard the sound of the side gate and looked up. Mother Sylvia Hayes came around the corner of the house carrying yellow tulips from the garden she had been quietly tending since Miss Odette passed. Sylvia was 81 years old and had been a church mother at Greater Refuge Baptist for more than 40 years. The kind of woman whose presence in a space changed the weight of it, not through anything she said, but through what she had witnessed and survived and continued standing in front of. She had known Miss Odette for 60 years. She had sat with her through her husband's death and her daughter's hardest years and the long, patient business of growing old in a house that had her name on the deed and her heart in the walls. Sylvia set the yellow tulips on the porch railing without ceremony, without announcement, the way you set something down when it belongs somewhere, and you are simply returning it. She stood beside Elaine and looked out at the land. The morning light was just beginning to find the edges of things, the tops of the trees, the corner of the old garden wall, the long grass at the property line that would need to be cut in the spring. Neither woman spoke for a while. That was the proper register for that morning. Not silence from absence, but silence from presence. Two women standing in the light on land that was theirs, that had always been theirs, that had been temporarily claimed by someone who had believed ownership was a thing you could take, rather than a thing you earned or inherited or were loved into. Elaine looked down at the brooch in her hand one more time. Then she lifted it and pinned it to the inside of her collar, against her chest, where no one could see it. The same place she had worn it on her wedding day. Not as performance, not as symbol. As the simple continuation of what her grandmother had meant by it. A woman always needs something of her own. Keep this close. She pressed it flat against her chest, closed her eyes for one breath, and then opened them toward the land. If this story stayed with you, press that like button. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that quiet is not the same as weak. Subscribe